The airport was alive with its usual rhythm. People rushed from gate to gate, rolling suitcases behind them, checking departure boards, and sipping on last-minute coffees. Among the noise and movement, there was one corner that looked calm, polished, and reserved only for special guests, the VIP section. This was where first-class passengers were welcomed, treated with comfort, and given service that promised respect and exclusivity. In this section sat a young man named David. He was about 25 years old, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans. He didn't wear expensive jewelry or branded clothing. His style was modest, even ordinary. But in his hand was a first-class boarding pass, reserved weeks in advance. He had every right to be sitting where he was. David wasn't just any passenger. He was the only son of a black CEO, one of the wealthiest and most respected business leaders in the country. But nobody in that lounge knew it, not yet. To everyone else, he looked like an ordinary traveler who might have stumbled into a seat that did not belong to him. David leaned back, quietly scrolling through his phone. Around him, other passengers sipped champagne, nibbled on small plates of food, and spoke in low voices. The atmosphere was peaceful until a flight attendant entered the lounge. She looked sharp in her uniform, carrying herself with authority. Her eyes scanned the room, and then they landed on David. Her brows furrowed. She walked toward him, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Excuse me," she said firmly. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." David looked up, surprised but polite. "No, this is my seat," he replied, holding up his boarding pass. The attendant barely glanced at it. "Sir, this seat is reserved for one of our valued first-class passengers. You'll need to move to economy." The words hit David like a cold wave. He blinked, trying to process what she had just said. He looked again at his ticket. It clearly said first class. He had followed every rule, booked properly, and checked in like everyone else. Still, he was being told he didn't belong. David calmly extended his ticket toward her again. "This is a first-class ticket," he said softly. "I'm supposed to be here." The attendant shook her head, impatient. "I understand, but this seat is now needed for another passenger. Please don't make this difficult." Whispers started among the nearby passengers. A few raised their eyebrows. Some leaned closer, curious. A man across the aisle muttered, "Looks like they're making him move." Another whispered, "Maybe he sneaked in here. Doesn't look first class to me." David's chest tightened. He wasn't angry, but the stares, the quiet judgments, and the lack of belief in his words all piled on him. Still, he stayed calm. "Miss," he said, "I have the right to sit here. I paid for this." Before she could reply, a white man in his late 50s approached. He wore a sharp suit and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to privilege. The attendant's face lit up in recognition. "Ah, Mr. Reynolds," she said warmly. "We have your seat ready for you." She then turned back to David. "Sir, please stand. This gentleman is our VIP passenger." David looked at the older man, then at the attendant. "And what am I?" he asked quietly, his voice steady but filled with quiet hurt. The attendant's smile faded slightly. "Sir, please cooperate." Passengers watched closely now. Some avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the situation. A few shook their heads, clearly sensing something wasn't right. But no one spoke up. David slowly stood, holding his ticket tightly. He didn't want to cause a scene. He didn't want to argue with someone who had already decided he didn't belong. So he quietly moved aside, letting Mr. Reynolds take his place. The older man sat down with a satisfied smile, thanking the attendant as if everything had been set right. David found another seat in the corner of the lounge. He sat down quietly, staring at his boarding pass again. It wasn't the money that hurt, it wasn't even the seat. It was the way he was treated, as if he wasn't worthy of being where he rightfully belonged. The whispers around him continued. A woman muttered, "I thought first class was exclusive. How did he even get a ticket?" Another man replied softly, "Well, he doesn't look like he belongs here, does he?" David closed his eyes for a moment. He felt the sting of their words, but he refused to let his emotions spill out. He had been raised differently. His father had always told him, "Your dignity is your crown. No one can take it unless you hand it to them." So he sat quietly, scrolling his phone again, while the room carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. But something unusual had happened. Hidden behind his calm face, David typed a short message on his phone. A message that would change everything in the next few minutes. The lounge attendants carried on with their tasks, offering drinks and snacks. The flight staff prepared the boarding gate. Mr. Reynolds sat comfortably in David's seat, sipping on champagne, completely unaware of who had just been moved for his convenience. What nobody in that lounge realized was that the young man they had judged, dismissed, and displaced was not just a passenger. He was the son of the very man who had power over the airline's future. For now, though, David stayed silent, waiting patiently. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was not to argue in the moment but to let the truth reveal itself at the right time. David sat in the corner of the lounge, his phone resting lightly in his hand. To anyone looking at him, he seemed calm, maybe even uninterested. But inside, his thoughts were moving quickly. He replayed what had just happened, not in anger, but in disbelief. The flight attendant had ignored his valid ticket, moved him aside, and treated him as though he was invisible. It wasn't the first time in his life that people had misjudged him by appearance, but it still stung. Passengers nearby were still whispering. Most of them assumed David had made some mistake or that his ticket wasn't real. A few shook their heads, thinking he was just another traveler trying to sneak into luxury. David heard it all, but he didn't reply. He just looked at the words on his ticket again, first class, as if reminding himself that he wasn't wrong. The man now sitting in his place, Mr. Reynolds, seemed perfectly content. He leaned back comfortably, sipping his champagne, adjusting his tie as if the world had just worked in his favor. The flight attendant who had asked David to move hovered around Reynolds, checking if he needed anything else, her tone polite and cheerful, completely different from how she had spoken to David moments earlier. From the outside, it looked like the matter was finished. The problem had been solved. David had moved, Reynolds had the seat, and the attendant had returned to her duties. But what no one knew was that the quiet young man they had dismissed was more powerful than anyone in that lounge realized. David typed a short message on his phone. He didn't write a long explanation. He didn't complain or pour out details. He simply sent a sentence to his father's private number, removed from VIP seat. Staff disrespectful. On flight 721. He put his phone away after sending it, as if it meant nothing. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, as if he was just another tired traveler waiting for his flight. Some passengers continued to glance at him, their eyes filled with quiet judgment. They couldn't understand why someone dressed so simply had dared to sit in the VIP seat. They didn't know his background. They didn't know that his father was one of the country's wealthiest black CEOs, a man who owned major stakes in several businesses including this very airline. David had chosen not to reveal who he was. That was his nature. He didn't like to announce his family name just to gain respect. He preferred to live like an ordinary person, to see the world as it really was. And moments like this always showed him the truth, how quickly people made judgments, how easily they decided someone's worth based only on appearance. While David waited quietly, the staff continued moving around, preparing for boarding. The lounge attendant who had spoken to him earlier never came back to check if he was comfortable. She didn't ask if he needed water, or if he was fine. To her, the matter was closed. But David's message had already been delivered. Miles away, his father, Mr. Carter, the CEO, sat in a boardroom with top executives. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, expecting a routine update, but when he read his son's message, his calm expression hardened. This wasn't just about his son being disrespected. It was about the principal. His son had been humiliated in a space where he had every right to be. If his son could be treated this way, how many other customers had faced the same? How many people had been pushed aside, ignored, or judged unfairly just because of how they looked? Mr. Carter excused himself from the meeting without explanation. His team watched him leave, surprised by the urgency on his face. He made a call immediately, his voice firm and controlled. "I want the senior airline managers at Gate 12 in 10 minutes. Flight 721. No delays." Back at the airport, David sat quietly as the minutes ticked by. Boarding was being announced soon. Passengers gathered their things, ready to move toward the gate. The attendant who had dismissed him earlier gave him only a brief look as she passed by, as though he wasn't important enough to acknowledge. David stood up slowly, adjusting his backpack, blending into the line. He didn't say a word. He didn't complain. He didn't reveal who he was. But a storm was already on its way. Just as the boarding announcement finished, several figures in business suits entered the lounge. Their presence immediately changed the atmosphere. These weren't ordinary staff members. They carried themselves with authority, their expressions tense. They scanned the room until they saw David standing quietly near the gate. The lounge attendants froze. Something felt unusual, almost unsettling. Passengers whispered again, curious about why high-ranking managers were suddenly here. One of the executives walked straight up to David. His voice was respectful, almost nervous. "Mr. Carter," he asked softly. David nodded. He didn't raise his voice, didn't announce anything. He just confirmed who he was. The room fell silent. Passengers who had doubted him moments earlier looked stunned. The lounge attendant's face drained of color. She now realized the young man she had dismissed, the one she had pushed aside for another passenger, was not just anyone. And then came the moment no one expected. The doors opened again, and in walked the CEO himself, David's father. Tall, confident, and composed, he entered the lounge with an air that demanded attention. Everyone turned toward him. Even the older man, Mr. Reynolds, set down his champagne glass nervously, sensing something important was unfolding. The CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the room with silence. He walked toward his son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. For a brief second, father and son exchanged a look that needed no words. Then Mr. Carter turned to face the staff. "Which one of you told my son to leave his seat?" he asked calmly, his voice steady but carrying weight. The attendant who had spoken to David earlier stood frozen, her lips parting but no words coming out. She knew there was no excuse that could make sense now. Passengers in the lounge held their breath, realizing they had just witnessed something extraordinary. They had seen a young man quietly endure disrespect, and now they were seeing the truth about who he really was. David remained silent, letting his father handle what came next. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was out in the open, and the weight of it was heavier than anything words could carry. What had started as a small moment of humiliation was about to turn into something much bigger, something that would remind everyone in that room about respect, dignity, and the power of quiet strength. The staff's confidence had vanished. The same people who had looked down on David minutes earlier were now staring at him with wide eyes, realizing how wrong they had been. The stage was set for what was coming next: accountability. And in just a matter of minutes, the entire staff would learn a lesson they would never forget. The lounge grew heavier with silence as soon as Mr. Carter, the CEO, entered. His presence commanded attention in a way that few people could. He was tall, with calm eyes and a measured walk. He didn't shout or rush, but every step seemed to tell the room that something serious was about to happen. The passengers, who had been whispering and judging just minutes ago, now sat straight, their conversations cut short. Even Mr. Reynolds, who had taken David's seat, looked uneasy and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. David stood quietly near the gate, his posture calm but strong. When his father placed a hand on his shoulder, it was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of reassurance and silent support. They didn't need words between them. They both knew what had happened, and now it was time for the truth to be faced. The senior managers who had rushed into the lounge followed behind Mr. Carter, their faces pale with tension. They had received his urgent call and knew this wasn't a routine matter. It was personal, and when something was personal to the CEO, it became a matter of great importance for the entire airline. Mr. Carter's voice was calm but clear, the kind of tone that made people listen without question. "I asked," he said slowly, his gaze moving across the staff, "which one of you told my son to leave his seat?" The flight attendant who had spoken to David earlier looked frozen in place. She tried to form words, but none came. Another attendant glanced at her nervously, but said nothing. The room seemed to hold its breath. Everyone knew what had happened, but no one wanted to admit it. David stayed quiet, not pointing fingers, not saying a word. That was his nature. He didn't need to shame anyone. His father's presence was enough to uncover the truth. After a long silence, the attendant finally stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I didn't know," she began, her voice weak. "You didn't know what?" Mr. Carter asked evenly. His tone wasn't angry, but it carried power. She swallowed hard. "I didn't know he was your son." For a moment, the words echoed in the lounge. A few passengers widened their eyes, realizing what she had just admitted. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow slightly, his calm expression unchanging. "So," he said slowly, "you're telling me he was removed not because of a mistake with his ticket, but because of how he looked to you. And it would have been acceptable if he wasn't my son." The attendant's eyes filled with panic. She shook her head quickly. "No, sir, that's not what I meant." Mr. Carter raised his hand gently, stopping her from continuing. He didn't need to hear excuses. The truth was already revealed, not only to him, but to every person in that lounge. He turned his attention to the managers who had accompanied him. "Is this how my customers are treated?" he asked them, his voice steady but carrying weight. "Is this the service you call first class? A valid passenger with a valid ticket is judged, humiliated, and removed, while another is placed in his seat simply because he looks the part." The managers shifted nervously, unable to meet his eyes. They knew there was no defense for what had happened. The passengers in the lounge remained silent, watching the scene unfold with full attention. Many of them, who had whispered their judgments earlier, now felt ashamed. They had assumed David didn't belong. They had believed the staff without question. Now, seeing the truth, they realized how quickly they had joined in the silent chorus of doubt. Mr. Reynolds, the older man who had taken David's seat, cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. The staff told me the seat was mine." His voice trailed off, unsure of how to continue. Mr. Carter turned to him briefly. "This is not about you, sir. This is about accountability. You were offered something that was not yours to take. But the fault does not rest on you, it rests on those who decided my son was not worthy of what he had rightfully paid for." Reynolds lowered his eyes, embarrassed. He sipped his champagne no longer. The CEO looked back at his son. David stood calmly, still not speaking. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than words. It showed dignity, patience, and strength. Mr. Carter turned once more to the staff. "Every passenger, no matter who they are, deserves respect. My son should not have to reveal his name or background to be treated fairly. No one should. If this is how you treat customers when you think no one important is watching, then this airline is not living up to the values it promises." The weight of his words sank into the room. The staff knew what was coming next. The passengers knew as well. This wasn't going to be ignored. Mr. Carter looked at the managers. "Take their badges," he said firmly. "They are no longer employees of this airline." Gasps filled the lounge. The attendants froze, shock written across their faces. One of them tried to protest, but the manager beside her quietly took her badge and access card. It was done swiftly, without hesitation. The passengers watched in stunned silence. Some of them nodded in approval, realizing justice was being served. Others looked uncomfortable, knowing they had been silent witnesses to the humiliation and had done nothing to stop it. David remained calm, watching the scene unfold. He didn't smile or celebrate. That wasn't his nature. He wasn't happy to see people lose their jobs, but he knew the lesson had to be learned. His father placed a hand on his shoulder again, a quiet gesture of reassurance. Then Mr. Carter addressed the passengers directly. "Let this be a reminder," he said, his voice steady. "No matter who you are, no matter how you dress, no matter where you come from, respect is not optional. It is a duty. And it will be upheld in every corner of this airline." The room was silent. Some passengers clapped softly, the sound growing louder as others joined. Soon, applause filled the lounge, not because of the power or wealth of the CEO, but because he had spoken a truth that resonated with everyone. David looked around and saw people's expressions changing. Some looked guilty, some looked thoughtful, and others seemed moved. He realized that his quiet patience, combined with his father's calm authority, had turned a moment of humiliation into a powerful lesson. As the staff members were escorted out quietly, the managers bowed their heads, promising to take immediate steps to prevent such behavior from happening again. David and his father moved toward the gate, ready to board. For David, the seat no longer mattered. What mattered was the principle that had been restored. The passengers who had judged him earlier now looked at him with respect, some even nodding as he passed. They had seen something remarkable, a moment where power was used not for pride, but for justice. And though the incident would soon spread far beyond the walls of that lounge, for everyone present that day, it was already a story they would never forget. The mood in the lounge shifted completely after the staff were escorted out. Where there had once been whispers of doubt and quiet judgment, now there was silence mixed with awe. Passengers who had earlier assumed David did not belong sat straighter in their seats, some even exchanging guilty glances. It was clear they were rethinking the way they had seen him just minutes before. David walked beside his father as they headed toward the boarding gate. He still carried himself with the same calm dignity he had shown throughout the ordeal. If anything, he looked even more composed now, as though the storm that had swept through the lounge had not shaken him at all. His father's steady presence had given him strength, and now the tables had turned. Everyone could see the truth. As they reached the gate, more senior executives appeared, rushing in with hurried steps. Their eyes darted around nervously, as though they were afraid they had already failed. One of them, a middle-aged man in a dark suit, stepped forward and bowed slightly toward Mr. Carter. "Sir," he said respectfully, "we are deeply sorry for what has happened. It does not reflect the standards of this airline. Please allow us to correct this immediately." Mr. Carter did not raise his voice. He spoke in the same calm tone he always used when making important decisions. "Correction does not erase the humiliation my son experienced. What happened cannot be undone. But what you can do is ensure it never happens again, not to him, not to anyone." The executive nodded quickly, his face red with shame. "Yes, sir. We will begin retraining immediately. This will not be repeated." Other passengers gathered closer, eager to see what would happen next. Some of them felt admiration, while others looked uneasy, realizing they had been silent when David was mistreated. A woman holding a designer handbag approached David timidly. "Young man," she said softly, "I want to apologize. I saw what happened, but I didn't speak up. I should have. You handled yourself with grace." David gave her a small smile. "Thank you," he replied gently. "Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. But the important thing is that we all learn from moments like this." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with respect. The boarding announcement echoed through the hall, and passengers began to line up. But this time, all eyes were on David and his father. The staff at the gate, trembling with nervousness, made sure every detail was perfect. They welcomed David with the highest respect, guiding him to his seat without hesitation. When David reached his original seat, the one he had been forced to give up, Mr. Reynolds was still sitting there. The older man stood up immediately, his face pale. "Young man," he said with a nervous smile, "please, this is yours." I shouldn't have taken it." David looked at him kindly. "It wasn't your fault," he said. "You were given the seat. But thank you for returning it." Reynolds gave a quick nod and stepped aside, embarrassed but relieved. David sat down again, this time with dignity restored. The passengers nearby looked at him differently now. Their eyes no longer held doubt, but respect. As the plane prepared for takeoff, whispers filled the cabin once more, but they were different now. Passengers weren't questioning David's right to be there, they were marveling at how he had handled the situation with such patience. Mr. Carter sat beside his son, his posture calm but powerful. He looked at David and said quietly, "You handled this well. You did not raise your voice. You did not argue. You let the truth reveal itself. That is strength." David nodded. "You always taught me that dignity is not about shouting louder, but about standing taller. I just remembered that." His father smiled softly, proud. "And that's why you will always command respect, because you don't demand it. You earn it." As the plane took off, David leaned back in his seat, finally allowing himself a moment to relax. The ordeal had been unpleasant, but he felt stronger for having endured it. He had been reminded of the world's harsh judgments, but also of the importance of patience and quiet courage. Meanwhile, in the airline's offices, news of the incident had already begun to spread. Executives exchanged urgent calls, aware that the CEO had personally intervened. The airline's reputation was at stake. Senior managers were preparing statements, training policies, and emergency meetings to address what had just unfolded. On board the flight, the atmosphere remained tense but respectful. The staff now moved with extra care, ensuring every detail was perfect for every passenger. It was as if the entire cabin had been reminded that no seat, no ticket, and no passenger should ever be judged unfairly. Midway through the flight, one of the senior flight attendants approached David cautiously. She held a tray of refreshments but paused before speaking. "Sir," she said respectfully, "on behalf of the crew, I want to apologize again. We deeply regret what happened earlier." David looked at her with the same calmness he had shown all along. "Thank you," he said softly. "But remember, don't just apologize to me. Treat everyone with respect, no matter who they are. That's the only way things change." She nodded, her eyes lowering in humility. "Yes, sir. I will remember." Other passengers overheard his words and exchanged looks. It was clear that the lesson of the day had not been lost. Hours later, when the flight landed, the story was already waiting outside. Journalists had caught wind of what had happened, and the incident was beginning to make headlines. Passengers stepped off the plane with the memory of what they had witnessed etched into their minds. They would tell their families, their friends, and their colleagues about the day they saw a young man quietly stand against humiliation and emerge with dignity intact. For David, it wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving who he was. It was about showing that respect should not depend on wealth, power, or appearance. His father's authority had brought accountability, but it was David's patience and composure that had truly transformed the moment. As he and his father left the airport, cameras clicked and microphones pushed forward. Reporters asked questions, but Mr. Carter simply said, "The message is simple. No one should ever be judged by how they look. Respect must be the first-class seat offered to everyone. And with that, he placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder once more. Together, they walked through the crowd, not just as CEO and heir, but as father and son united by dignity, patience, and the quiet strength that had turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson for the world. The story did not end when David and his father left the airport. In many ways, it was only the beginning. By the time they reached their destination, news outlets had already started reporting the incident. Passengers who had been in the lounge and on the flight posted their accounts online, describing how a young man with a valid first-class ticket was humiliated simply because he did not look the part. Their stories spread quickly, accompanied by photos and videos taken quietly during the ordeal. Within hours, the incident became a trending topic. Social media was filled with comments. Some expressed outrage, some shared personal experiences of being judged unfairly, and others applauded David's calmness. People were shocked to learn that the young man in the story was the son of one of the country's most respected CEOs. But more than that, they were inspired by the way both father and son had handled the situation. The world had seen many moments of public anger, but this one was different. There had been no shouting, no chaos, no loss of control. Instead, there was patience, dignity, and measured justice. It was a reminder that real strength often lies in quiet composure. The airline was forced to respond quickly. Press releases were issued, promising immediate reforms. Senior executives held emergency meetings. They knew the incident had damaged their reputation, but they also saw an opportunity to show accountability. Training programs were announced, focusing on equality, respect, and fairness. For once, the company could not hide behind polished advertisements, it had to act. Meanwhile, David chose to remain quiet in the public eye. He did not give interviews or post statements. He preferred silence, allowing the story to speak for itself. But his silence only increased people's respect for him. Many admired how he had not tried to use his family name or wealth to defend himself during the ordeal. Instead, he had stayed patient, letting the truth unfold naturally. His father, Mr. Carter, however, made a public statement a few days later. Standing before cameras, he spoke with the same calm authority he had shown in the lounge. "This incident is not about my son," he began. "It is about every person who has ever been judged unfairly. It is about the countless times dignity has been taken from someone simply because of appearance. No one, rich or poor, young or old, should ever be treated as less than they are." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "I am grateful for the passengers who later admitted their silence. But let this be a reminder, silence in the face of injustice can be as harmful as the act itself. Respect is not a luxury. It is a basic right. And it must be given freely, to all." The statement was broadcast widely, reaching millions. People discussed it in offices, schools, and homes. Many shared their own experiences of being dismissed or underestimated. The story became more than just an incident at an airport, it became a mirror, forcing society to look at its own biases. Back at home, David reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the humiliation, the whispers, the stares, and then the powerful way his father had stepped in. But what stayed with him most was the feeling of quiet strength he had discovered in himself. He realized that his father's lessons about dignity had not just been words, they had been seeds planted long ago, now growing inside him. He remembered one phrase his father had often repeated: "Power is not shown by how loud you are, but by how calm you remain when the world tries to shake you." That phrase had guided him through the ordeal, and now it guided him into the future. Weeks later, David received letters and messages from strangers all over the world. Some thanked him for showing patience. Others told him how his story gave them courage in their own struggles. One young man wrote, "I've been told many times that I don't belong. Watching how you handled yourself showed me that I don't need to prove myself to everyone. I just need to stay true to who I am." These words touched David deeply. He realized that what had started as a moment of humiliation had transformed into a lesson for many. His pain had turned into someone else's strength. The airline, under pressure, introduced new rules and training. They highlighted respect in every customer interaction. Though policies alone could not erase prejudice, it was a step forward. The CEO's direct involvement had forced them to take the issue seriously. For David and his father, life went on, but the memory of that day remained. It was not just about a seat in a lounge. It was about dignity, fairness, and the reminder that respect should never depend on appearance. One evening, sitting on the porch of their home, David turned to his father. "Do you think the world will change after this?" he asked. His father looked at him thoughtfully. "The world doesn't change in one day," he said. "But every action plants a seed. What happened at the airport planted many seeds. Some will grow slowly, but they will grow. And you were the one who watered them with patience." David smiled at his father's words. He realized then that his calmness had not been weakness, it had been strength. A quiet kind of strength that touched people more deeply than anger ever could. The story of that day continued to be told, not just in newspapers, but in conversations between friends, in classrooms, and in workplaces. It became an example, a reminder that dignity is powerful, and that respect is something every person deserves. And for David, the lesson was clear: the world may judge by appearances, but true worth is revealed by actions. He had been dismissed as someone who didn't belong, but in the end, he showed everyone that dignity itself was the real first-class ticket.